What are the major parties promised for the NBN?
And what should they be actually promising during the election campaign? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists and commentators to dive into the big tech stories of the week. As you may have heard, there's a federal election looming, and once again, the NBN is the center of attention. So we're going to jump straight into it this week. I'm joined, as usual, by Alex Kidman, the man who's bringing back sexy to podcasting, and also our special guest, Dr. Mark A. Gregory, Associate Professor in the School of Engineering at RMIT. Mark, welcome to the show. So we should say at the outlet, we haven't become a political podcast. I'm sure if you read between the lines, you probably get a rough idea of how Alex and I lean. But there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the NBN, and maybe it might determine how you cast your vote. And it's been going on for a long time. The NBN's been a bit of an election football for the last, a bit of a political football for the last few elections. Both parties, major parties, have come out and made their promises about this is what we might see from the election, or from the NBN if they win. Mark, what have they put on the table?
Well, the basics are that we've got a couple of key promises going into this election. One which both parties agree upon, and that's the $750 million upgrade to the fixed wireless network, which will benefit the fixed wireless users, but it'll also benefit the people on satellite, because some of the people on satellite will be shifted onto the fixed wireless network, and therefore the satellite will have more capacity for those users that are remaining. So that's the first thing, and that's really something that both political parties have agreed upon. The second thing is this idea of replacing the fibre to the node with fibre to the premises. And so we've really got two different offers on the table here. The first is that the coalition are talking about moving up to 2 million of the 4.1 million premises that are on fibre to the node onto fibre. But that's only if people opt to take a higher plan, like 100 megabit per second or higher plan. So it's really like an opt-in scenario. And that in itself has problems if you're a person that can't afford to sign up to one of these, very expensive plans. Now, on the other side, we've got the Labor plan, which is to move 3.5 million premises onto fibre. Now, under the Labor plan, people can opt to move across to fibre, and they're not being required to sign up to a higher plan.
So it's not mandatory. They're not going to automatically roll it down every street. But to get it, you don't have to go up to a more expensive plan. You can just say, I'd like to go on fibre, please, but stay exactly on the plan I'm on.
That's right. And it will be something which will be managed in terms of how this is done. So really it's a case of 2.5 million plus a higher plan versus 3.5 million. So it still means, that there will be about 600,000 premises that are going to be left out of either of the plans. And the idea of the Labor plan, for example, which talks about the greatest number of premises, is that they would have that done by about 2025. So they're really trying to do it in one term of government if they get elected.
We've been burnt like that before, haven't we? They've got to get in and get it done before we ever change a government and it all goes to crap again.
Well, in the sense that if we look at the last couple of elections, yes, it has been a political football, and yes, there's been a lot of promises made that haven't really worked out how we wanted it to. And so it's the promises that everyone is, really getting tired of, where we get these promises that it's going to happen and it never happens. Now, in terms of political footballs, there's there's a degree of concern about the statements coming out of the Department of Communications, but also from NBN because they seem to ramp up these statements about what they're going to do, and we're going to do this, and we're going to. And these ramp ups always seem to occur in the 3 months prior to an election.
Strangely enough.
Yeah, so there's also concern, in that regard, that the public servants are being used for party political purposes or their organisations. So that also is something that is of a concern when we talk about the NBN.
So, Mark, with the Labor, one detail I wasn't aware of with the Labor plan was this idea that you wouldn't have to jump up pricing tiers.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
Are they still talking? Do we know? Does their what they've said so far make it clear whether or not they're still doing the effective fibre to the street, but you have to opt to hook in? If people, for some reason, wanted to stay on fibre to the node, or just didn't want the fuss of getting that last 100 metres or whatever of fibre put in, will they have that option, or is Labor basically saying, as opposed to the current NBN, current coalition plan, which is fibre in the street and then you hook up to it, is Labor basically saying, no, we'll run it through to the houses as well?
So my understanding of the Labor plan is that they're going to run it through to the houses. I mean, ultimately, whichever approach you're looking at, fibre to the node is obsolete. It's unreliable and it has to be replaced. Now, the question is how do you do that, and over what time frame do you do it? Now, the concern I have about the coalition's plan is that there's only going to be a small percentage take up that offer, because it does mean that you're going to have to opt into a higher plan. And, that's going to mean that quite a large number of premises or people are not going to take up that because they've got other concerns, right? We've got other inflationary concerns, petrol's going up, rent's going up, and so on. So this is a problem that the government's made, and this is a problem that the government needs to solve, but without trying to ransack everyone's pocket doing it. And that is the problem. Now, if you notice that if you've got a fibre to the basement, you're also left out of this particular round of fixes. And so, we've got all of these areas that are not part of the current fix. And so if you look at what's on the table from the major parties, you would have to say that out of 10, one of them gets, sort of like a 7, and the other one gets sort of like a 3. But neither of them are getting to a 10, right?
Well, a 10 would be going back to the old plan. Like, there's no scenario in which someone turns around and says, we're going back fibre for everyone, is there? It's too late for that.
Oh, well, it's not too late. We're going to get there, right? We will get there, but how long?
Oh, I would think
because you've got to remember
decades.
that New Zealand's just done what we were going to do. Right?
Yeah, but they didn't go about it the way we went about it. They didn't go, via X, Y, and Z.
No, so that was the thing, is that what has happened overseas is that we were a couple of years ahead of the rest of the world, because most of the rest of the world did fibre to the node in the 20s.
Yeah.
But we didn't, right? And we all know that Howard spent 3 years negotiating with Telstra. Rudd came on the scene. Rudd spent 2 years negotiating with Telstra. And at the end of that, after 5 years of negotiation, they threw their hands in the air, and Rudd called an expert panel together and said, okay, we need another way, because this is not going anywhere. Now, so the rest of the world did fibre to the node in the 20s. We didn't. So we got to 2009. The expert panel said, look, fibre to the node is now obsolete. Go over it and go straight to fibre, right? And do a fibre rollout. So in 2014, we went back to fibre to the node. But at that point, the rest of the world was saying, okay, time for fibre.
Yeah.
So the rest of the world has been madly rolling out fibre. And, large numbers of countries will have finished their rollouts by 2025. Whereas we're going to be in this situation by 2025 where we've still got a long, long way to go, particularly if the coalition wins the election, and to a lesser degree if Labor wins the election. Because remember, under the coalition's plan, there's no timeline, right? It's that you can get it if you opt for it, and there's no end date or no timeline to actually moving everyone to fibre. So under their plan, it could be decades.
Well, it strikes me that there's a big engineering difference, I guess, between these as well. Because if the Labor plan is right, we will roll fibre out, we'll get rid of the copper, presumably get rid of a certain number of the nodes as well, which would lessen complexity. But that would mean you'd just end up with it in natural course. Whereas an opt-in scheme, you've presumably got to actually wait for an installer to be available. They might have rolled the fibre past last week, but it might have been 3 years ago if you've moved, and it might be more difficult to actually get that to work, even if you wanted it.
Oh, most certainly. So the opt-in route is fraught with that problem, right? Is that is there an installer available? Is your area eligible? Where are they, and so forth. And it can be quite problematic. It's a bit like people that opted in for the technology transfer that was being offered by NBN Co. The very, very expensive technology
the five-figure technology transfer.
And you often had to wait for months before a team became available to do your premises. And so that is a problem with the opt-in. There's no doubt that ultimately it's cheaper to just simply roll construction teams through a suburb and get it done. Right now, my projections at this stage are that we're now looking at more than 70 billion for the NBN rollout. Now, if they had have done fibre from 2009 like they were going to do, the projections are that it would have cost around 46 to 50 billion. So we're going past the 20 billion over the top now, right? And if it keeps going like this, we'll reach 30 billion in terms of extra funds that have had to be put into this.
You mentioned fibre to the basement. That doesn't see an upgrade. What do we know about technologies like fibre to the curb or the percentage who are on HFC in terms of upgrades, if at all?
So at this stage, the fibre to the curb is going to be included in this upgrade program because we have some suburbs that are partially fibre to the curb and partially fibre to the node. Also, the G.fast that was spruiked heavily by the coalition government that it would be rolled out by 2019 and we'd all have gigabit connections. Of course, that hasn't happened because there's been a lot of problems with fibre to the node, fibre to the curb. You may have seen in the media that more than 50,000 of the DPUs, the little electronic boxes that sit in the curb, have had to be replaced because they've been dying because of electricity, lightning, water, and all sorts of other problems.
I remember Bill Murray telling me how great they were. I was there when he was standing in the street holding one up, showing it to journalists how it was going to transform the NBN.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was not how it's eventuated in reality, right? And so fibre to the curb upgrade to G.fast is not happening, and fibre to the curb is being rolled into this upgrade program because everyone has decided that fibre to the curb, hasn't worked out how they thought it would work out.
So fibre to the curb's dead in that they're not rolling out any more. There's no one.
That's right.
So there's no one who today.
Fibre to the curb.
Yeah, if you're on fibre to the node today, no one's going to put you on fibre to the curb. You're either staying where you are or you're going on fibre to the premises.
That's right. And for those people on fibre to the curb, they will be encouraged to move to fibre to the premises as well as part of this program.
Even the Liberals or only under Labor? Because I could see that'd be a great place for the Liberals to cut corners and go, oh, no, you got fibre to the curb. That's close enough, mate. Sorry, you can't have it.
The way that the coalition's doing it is on the suburb by suburb.
Yeah.
So it's really what technologies are in each of those suburbs that they've selected. And so it's inevitable that some of the suburbs will have parts of fibre to the curb, and parts will be fibre to the node. But this is one of the things, is that NBN co has become very opaque, and so we don't really know what's going on in terms of what technologies are where and what amounts. Now, the HFC, which a lot of money was spent fixing that and upgrading it, and of course they bought Optus cable and then they just
Realised how bad it
wrote the
was.
money off.
We told them it was crap before they bought it. Everyone told them it was crap before they bought it. They went, no, she'll be right, mate. Oh, wow, it's not good.
So I think that was another $800 million down the drain.
Yep.
And
great if you're Optus.
Yeah, good for Optus, but I think there's a lot of conspiracies around why that $800 million was given to Optus, and one day it might be interesting to find out. But anyway, that has been upgraded to DOCSIS 3.1. So potentially, people that are on HFC can get gigabit speeds. There is congestion, like all the technologies. There are other issues, but at this stage, that is not part of these upgrade programs, because even though HFC does utilise some copper, it's coaxial copper, it's not telephone copper.
Yeah.
And so the goal at this stage is the fibre to the node. Now, at some point, I would see that the HFC will slowly get replaced with fibre to the premises, because it would be pointless in the future to keep upgrading the HFC or to try and upgrade the HFC. And the latest coming out of the United States is that the pathway from HFC DOCSIS 3.1 is to go to fibre.
Yeah.
Right? So there's no talk, of DOCSIS 4, for example, at this stage, because, look, New Zealand has already started rolling out 10 gigabit fibre. And all over, like a lot of parts of Europe and America, you can now get 10 gig fibre, with the third generation passive optical network. We have to remember that third generation passive optical network was approved as a standard back in 2010. First generation was approved back in 2004-5. So this stuff is old.
It's well established.
And so countries are already moving to third generation PON, right, which is 10 gigabit or 40 gigabit PON. And so, there's just no way that HFC is going to be able to compete with that. So the next stage for HFC is to put fibre into premises.
I would think by keeping the HFC and keeping some fibre to the curb, you're making the network more complex and more expensive to run, because you've got to maintain all these different technologies. You've got to manage all these different technologies. Whereas one of the things with fibre to the premises for almost everybody was at least then there's one network that you have to manage.
Oh, look, absolutely. We know that the hybrid network, the extra additional costs are just shy of $1 billion a year in additional
just
operational
a cheeky billion
costs. Yeah. If they had have kept going with the fibre, then that would be $1 billion that they would be able to pocket, into their books, rather than seeing that money going out through operational costs. We're seeing that in the daily things online on social media, problems people are having with the NBN. And yes, absolutely, it's about going to a new technology, but also standardising on that, right? You don't want that mix, because the mix of technologies means you've got to have extra costs. And so, that was another flaw to the original plan that, unfortunately, the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, just didn't get that.
Even though surely Malcolm, Mr. Internet, must have known that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've learnt a lot over the last sort of 8 years about how that plan came about and the individuals that were involved with the plan. And it is an example of a situation where a political party should be utilising experts in the field, rather than politicians and their advisors trying to work out what to do themselves, because this is going to cost the nation not only more than 20 billion, to 25 billion more than it should have, but it's put us behind in the global digital economy. We were going to be able to be up there and competing with, all of our competitor nations, but now we're going to be so far behind, it's not funny.
So the alternative that often gets touted here, and you kind of mentioned this at the start with fixed wireless seeing an upgrade and that making satellite a little bit easier for very remote Australians, are the competing wireless technologies. So things like Starlink and even the 5G home broadband that the likes of Telstra and Optus sell. What's your view on that as a competing, just as a competing technology, not necessarily as a political play?
Well, of course, low Earth orbit satellite constellations have been talked about for 30 odd years. And it's only, of course, recently that the technology and the willpower to do it properly has come about. And so we've got two vastly different offerings between OneWeb and Starlink. They're quite different technologies. One's aimed more at business, and the other one is aimed more at broadband. So OneWeb is more aimed at a business phone connectivity type, right? So it's using a different strategy than Starlink, which is just going for a straight mass broadband approach. And that in itself is quite interesting. So then, they're not head to head in terms of what they're doing. Now, in terms of Starlink, there are two issues always with satellite. One is the cost, right? And two is what performance you get once you get large numbers of people connecting, right? Now, we already see this. If you're an early adopter with 5G, as some of us were with 4G, for a while it's great because there's no one else connected. So everything is wonderful. You get great speeds and so forth. But then, of course, reality sets in when everyone updates their handsets and you start getting much lower performance. So the situation could be the same with Starlink, and we haven't gotten any information out of them yet in terms of how many customers per node or satellite flying overhead. What will be the anticipated capacity, and how much can it carry? How many people can it support? We haven't gotten the hard detail we need to know what's going to happen. However, I do hazard a warning that anything to do with satellite, it's a limited resource. So therefore, as you add more people, the capacity is going to reduce. But for many people in Australia, it's going to be great because they're the only house in a 5,000 square mile area, right? So it's going to go head to head with the NBN SkyMuster satellites.
Did they shunt too many people across the Sky Muster when they were trying to rejig the NBN and save money?
Absolutely, right? And again, this was another negative outcome of the changes that the coalition government made, because the SkyMuster satellites were always a limited resource, and you can't just keep packing people onto them, especially if you want them to be able to provide, the resource that people need for it to be practically useful. The big difference now, though, between the SkyMuster satellites and Starlink is that one of them is going to be GEO satellite, which means a lot more delay. The other one's LEO, which means a lot less delay. So then that gives a tick in the LEO box. But it comes down to the other two things, which is the cost and capacity. So the jury is still out in terms of that outcome. People that have got Starlink now are reporting fantastic speeds over the connection.
Because they're the early adopters, like we talked about before.
Absolutely, and of course they're paying more than what they're paying for the NBN satellite. If you look at the costs are quite considerable. So looking at it from a socially equitable outcome, we are moving further away from outcomes that are socially equitable. If we say, well, God, just get Starlink, Well, a lot of Australians can't afford to get Starlink, and already our NBN is costing far more than it should, not just from a capex or an opex point of view, but the amount that customers are having to pay to connect to the NBN is far higher than it should be. And whilst we've still got this connectivity virtual charge, in other words, where data usage is being part of the charging mix, the NBN will remain high in terms of the cost. Some countries have got rid of data usage charging, like New Zealand, and the outcome has been fantastic for the consumer in New Zealand. But even if we look at what the ACCC was doing with its new price determination for the NBN, NBN Co is fighting tooth and nail to keep the CVC in there somewhere. And inevitably, that means that the NBN will be far more expensive than it should be for consumers. And consumers that can't afford those high prices are going to have problems. They're going to miss out. And that's the concern.
Has CVC been mentioned so far in the election campaign? Because I know there was a big thing maybe last year where there was a push to get rid of it, but has the coalition or Labor dared to utter those three little letters, or that they just hope they can sweep it under the carpet?
I think at this point, the situation is that they've both sort of let it go in terms of getting into the detail of their offerings, and they're both trying to stay at a sort of a conceptual concept level by talking, large numbers of people and large numbers of outcomes. But at some point, the pricing for the NBN will have to be tackled and how this works. Now, on a positive note, Labor have announced that they would utilise data that was collected during COVID by schools to offer free internet to 30,000 students or families, if you like, for a 1 year period. Because it was found that there were large numbers of families that didn't have broadband. So if you're trying to study from home, like students were during COVID, there were large numbers of students that couldn't study because they had no broadband at home. And that's one of the things that we have to hark back to, is that telecommunications is an essential service, and everyone needs it. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, everyone needs it. And so as a nation, we need to make sure that everyone can get access to it.
It's also a bit of speaking to the schools thing, and I think that's a brilliant initiative. It's a rising tides all boats kind of scenario. My better half is a school teacher and was teaching to students who had broadband and some who didn't last year when we were locked down. And the ones who didn't, she'd print stuff off and stuff would get delivered, and it was an awful lot more work from a school's side, which is then less time they can put into teaching. Whereas if they've all got broadband, it is easier to do more for kids being taught. It's a win-win on both sides. I'm surprised there's not more noise about that kind of thing.
Well, I think that there are groups of people like myself and of course, ACOS and a lot of, sort of groups that see the impact of these, lack of access to basic services, that are arguing, for that to be provided. The problem is that in an election campaign, often this just, is something which goes under the carpet because, I think political parties feel that their voters are going to be the majority, and, the majority with jobs or the majority with whatever. And often the minorities, like people that can't afford to have broadband, are not a key focus, if so. Um, it's something though that I'm constantly campaigning for, is that broadband is something that needs to be provided to people that can't afford it. Even if it's not a top tier speed, they need something. Everyone needs something. It's a bit like water and electricity. Everyone needs to be able to access it.
So, Mark, where do we go from here? Regardless of who wins the election, what should the NBN be doing next, and what should they be doing thinking long term?
I think that the first thing that NBN Co needs to be doing is finishing the NBN to the original plan. They need to be open about it and publish a timeline where they're going to get fibre to 93% of premises, 4% fixed wireless, 3% satellite. They need to have be open about their plans to compete with smaller companies, with the Starlinks of this world. How do they see the future in terms of competition? I also think they need to be more open about how does Australia move from first generation optical fibre technologies to third generation, like other countries that have already started moving. How are we going to move from where we are to the future? So really, NBN Co needs to stop focusing on itself and its desire to promote itself as being outstanding when it's really not. And it needs to be focused more on consumers and on how it can improve from where it's at. Because if you look at NBN Co as an organisation, it has a long way to go before it's meeting community needs, and it has a long way to go before it's able to call itself world class.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Mark for joining us for the show.
Thank you for having me here today. It was great to talk to you both.
It's been great having you on the show. So, Mark, if people want to read what you've written online or find you on social media, how can they do that?
Well, I'm available, of course, through the university, but I'm also available on LinkedIn. I have a Twitter presence, which I get a lot of comments and feedback through Twitter. So you can find me on any of those platforms. And I'm quite happy to answer questions and to talk about telecommunications and particularly, how to improve telecommunications for people in regional and rural areas.
I've seen you work on the conversation as well.
Definitely, yes. I also write for the conversation periodically.
Awesome. Excellent. And as always, you can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, at verticalhold.com.au, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And as always, thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice and tell your friends about us to help us spread the good word in 2022. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. I thought you said skip the question. It's fine.
No, I meant skip the other question.
I'll skip the other question. Okay.
Yeah,
sorry. I need more coffee. It's been a long day.
It's only 3 in the afternoon. It's still early.
It's been a long day. Trust me.